Shalom, shalom, peace be with you, peace be upon you. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and today, while having a coffee break, we were looking for interesting old books to review and bring you a video on them. We found this in the public domain, public access, freely available, and it's called A History of Ancient Egypt by George Rawlinson, born 1812, died 1902, and it was published around about 1880. Egyptian History to 640 AD, the Egyptian Civilization, published in New York Nottingham Society. And here we found this note which says copyright evidence. Evidence reported by Alex Aiken for item History of Ancient 01 etc. on April 17, 2008. No visible notice of copyright. Exact publication date unknown. So, being in the public domain, public access, this is probably saying that we won't get for ourselves a copyright strike or claim from or for our YouTube channel. We should be okay. Well, what interested us mainly in this particular book, okay, you got the usual contents page, preface, and so forth. Okay, this is the deluxe edition by the works of George Rawlinson, M.A., History of Ancient Egypt, Volume 1. It says Volume 4, Maps, Diagrams and Illustration, the Nottingham Society, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. So before we look into it, let's have a look for the history on George Rawlinson. Born 23rd November 1812, died 6 October 1902, a British scholar, historian and Christian theologian. He was born at Chadlington, Oxfordshire, it would be in England, UK, son of Abraham Tissac Rawlinson and younger brother of the famous Assyriologist Sir Henry Rawlinson. He was educated at Ealing School, having taken a first in Literae Humaniores at the University of Oxford from Trinity College in 1838. He was elected to a fellowship at Exeter College in 1840, where he was a fellow tutor from 1842 to 1846, and so forth. And this is publications. His chief publications are his translations of the history of Herodotus in collaboration with Sir Henry Rawlinson and Sir John Gardner Wilkinson, Henry being his brother. 1858 to 60, Five Great Monarchies of the Ancient World, Eastern World, 1862 to 67, and so forth. His lectures to an audience at Oxford University on the topic of the accuracy of the Bible in 1859 were published in later years as the apologetic work, The Historical Evidences of the Truth of the Scriptures, of the Scripture Records Stated Anew. He was also a contributor to the Speaker's Commentary, the Public Commentary, Smith's Dictionary of the Bible, and various similar publications. He was the author of the article Herodotus in the 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is at least 250 years plus old and pretty reliable. Okay, if you're not a person who likes, if you're a person who doesn't really like Wikipedia, you can see as well on Wikipedia, we can always try Britannica. Yeah. Probably more reliable than Wikipedia, because Wikipedia sometimes has misinformation, etc. So he decided, well, that's a pretty short history of him, maybe there's more, and we just found this one, which I said Rawlinson was born 1812, etc. English Orientalist and historian, educated at Oxford. He is known for his long, authoritative and still useful histories of the ancient world. His most famous history is that of the Five Great Monarchies of the Ancient Eastern World, 4 volumes, 1862 to 67. He and his brother Sir Henry C. Rawlinson, of whom he wrote a biography, edited works by Herodotus. And that's from the Columbia Encyclopedia 6th edition. And that's very small information, so I thought we'd look even further, find the dirt on him. Okay, if there was any. Bible encyclopedias, George Rawlinson, 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, and basically the same history, what we've read. And CC copyright statement, these files are public domain. There's not much on them there. But that's a brief history of who George Rawlinson actually was. So let's go back to this book. Because what really interested us, okay, here's your preface. Okay, all about him and his history and his findings, etc., etc. Here's the contents page, geography of Egypt, boundaries, etc. We were looking at this, the people and their neighbours, on page 48. We found this highly interesting, and we suddenly realised, oh my gosh, when we get there, you're going a bit too far forward. And you'll get a shock as well if you are a person who enjoys listening to Sarneta's House of Consciousness or Sarneta TV, and the Hebrew Israelites or the ancient Egyptian Kemetic followers and their rants that they put across there. We may have found that they are completely wrong, okay, in regards to the origins of the African people, or the Egyptians being African people, according to Rawlinson. They may say, oh, but that's a white man, a European, so yeah, don't believe him. But he's the only one that's presenting this history that we've come across in this moment in time. Chapter 3, the people and their neighbours. The Egyptians of Asiatic origin, immigrants from the east, not a colony from Ethiopia. Proof of this so far peculiar as to constitute a distinct race. Their complexion dark but not black, their hair not woolly. Description of the features of their form, their subdivisions, original and later, their intellectual characteristics, their artistic powers, their morality, theoretic and practical, their number, nations bordering upon Egypt, the Libyans or Libyans, or Tahinu on the west, the Nehai. Okay, we're going to make this bigger so you can actually see it's very small. Oh, it looks like the Nasi. Just check that out. Nahsi, or Negroes and Kush, Ethiopians. On the south, the Amu, Shemites and Shasu Arabs on the east. Nascent empires in this quarter. It's got this in Latin, by the looks of it. It's like Latin, or is it German? Let's have a closer look at that. The Egypter von allen Angren, Zenden, Menschen, Rassen, etc., etc. Neighbour, Vortrag über Alter, and so forth, volume 1, page 57. It is generally allowed by modern ethnologists that the ancient Egyptians, although located in Africa, were not an African people. It's according to Rawlinson, etc. Although located in Africa, they were not an African people. Neither the formation of their skulls, nor their physiognomy, nor their complexion, nor the quality of their hair, nor the general proportions of their frames connect them in any way with the indigenous African races, the Berbers and the Negroes. Nor, again, is their language in the least like those of the African tribes. The skull and facial outline both of the ancient Egyptian and of the modern Coptic, the Ethiopian, his existing representative are Caucasian, and the Egyptian language, while of a peculiar type, has analogies which connect it both with the Semitic and with the Indo-European forms of speech, more especially with the former. We must regard the Egyptians, therefore, as an Asiatic people, immigrants into their own territory, which they entered from the east, and nearly allied to several important races of southwestern Asia, as the Canaanites, the Akkadians or primitive Babylonians, and the southern or Himyaritic Arabs. So this possibly proves, well, we assume it does prove, that these Egyptians came out of one location, one geographical location. They were part of a certain tribe of peoples, nations of peoples from the Middle East. The Syrians, the Mesopotamians, or the Assyrians. They came from there. Let's look at the biblical scriptures. Genesis, the Brita in the Aramaic, or Genesis in English, and also your modern Americanized modern English Bible versions, which state that Adam and Eve, etc., were created by God. In Euphrates, around that area, there's a river that ran through the Garden of Eden, paradise, and it watered the garden, and it split into 4 heads or tributaries. The Gishon, Pishon, etc., and there's the Euphrates and Tigris, and these ran around the land of Ashur, Cush, and so forth. So it again, it is generally allowed by modern ethnologists that the ancient Egyptians, although located in Africa, were not an African people. Neither the formation of their skulls, nor their physiognomy, nor the complexion, nor the qualities of the hair, nor the general proportions of their frames connects them with, in any way, with the indigenous African races, the Berbers and the Negroes. Nor again is their language in the least like those of the African tribes. The skull and facial outline both of the ancient Egyptian and of the modern Copt, or Ethiopian, his existing representative, are Caucasian, and the Egyptian language, while of a peculiar type, has analogies which connect it both with Semitic and with the Indo-European forms of speech, more especially with the former. So they were originally from a Syrian area, or a geographical location in Assyria, according to the biblical Genesis account, or the Brita in the original ancient, very old Tab Ashur or Aramaic. We must regard the Egyptians, therefore, as an Asiatic people, immigrants into their own territory. They came from somewhere else and they went into that territory. They probably followed these rivers, and then they come across the Nile, and they saw that it was quite lush, etc., so they started creating these prototype mounds which lead up to these Egyptian pyramids, etc., etc., and they created a civilization there. We must regard the Egyptians, therefore, as an Asiatic people, immigrants into their own territory which they entered from the east, and nearly allied to several important races of southwestern Asia, as the Canaanites, the Akkadians or primitive Babylonians, and the southern or Himyaritic Arabs. So that's probably where they originated from. Well, they spread out, and they were the Canaanites, the Akkadians, or primitive Babylonians, pre-Babylonians, right? And the southern or Himyaritic Arabs, nomads, desert wanderers. Not talking about Arab Muslims, etc., etc. It has been maintained by some that the immigration was from the south, the Egyptians having been a colony from Ethiopia, which gradually descended the Nile and established itself in the middle and lower portions of the valley. And this theory can plead in its favour both a positive statement of Diodorus, must be some Greek historian, or someone who had written it all down, and the fact, which is quite certain, of an ethnic connection between the Egyptians and some of the tribes who now occupy Abyssinia, the ancient Ethiopia. So maybe they come out of the Middle East and then they migrated there. Okay, maybe that's what it's saying. But modern research has shown quite unmistakably that the movement of the Egyptians was in the opposite direction. So what we're trying to say is that maybe they come from that Middle Eastern area originally and then migrated to Africa. So there was no out of Africa experience, as claimed. It was actually a walk into Africa. They walked into Africa and occupied Abyssinia or ancient Ethiopia. But modern research has shown quite unmistakably that the movement of the Egyptians was in the opposite direction. The study of the monuments, says the latest historian of Egypt at that particular time, of Rawlinson, when Rawlinson wrote this, furnishes incontrovertible evidence that the historical series of Egyptian temples, tombs and cities constructed on either bank of the Nile follow one upon the other in chronological order, in such sort that the monuments of the greatest antiquity, the pyramids for instance, are situated further to the north, while the nearer one approaches the Ethiopian cataracts, the more do the monuments lose the stamp of antiquity, and the more plainly do they show the decline of art, of beauty and of good taste. Moreover, in Ethiopia itself, the existing remains present us with a style of art that is absolutely devoid of originality. At the first glance, one can easily see that it represents Egyptian art in its degeneracy, and an art ill understood and ill executed. The utmost height to which Ethiopian civilization ever reached was a mere rude imitation, alike in science and in art, of Egyptian models. So they made everything after somebody else who'd already done it right. We must look then rather to Syria or Arabia than to Ethiopia. Don't forget these names here. Syria weren't actually the names of those geographical locations. These are Greek Latin loan words, this here being a "in" suffix, which means that that area was occupied by certain people. Yeah. When the Greeks went back to where to their land, whatever, and the people asked them, "Hey, where'd you go?" "Oh, we went to this geographical location." "Oh, what was that like?" "Oh, there's a bunch of people there that spoke a certain language. They were occupying that particular geographical location, so we decided to call it Syria, because that's what it means. Those who are in possession of, okay? Those who are occupying. And you have Syriac, which is basically those who had a certain language. They owned it, they spoke it. Okay, so we must look then rather to Syria or Arabia than to Ethiopia as the cradle of the Egyptian nation. Okay? So that's where they came from. So Mesopotamia, Syria, etc. was the first cradle of civilization. But look at it in this way, the Egyptians were the first civilization. Right? They stopped fighting each other, squabbling amongst each other, warring against each other, and they united south and north, north which was actually the south, and south which was actually the north, and they become this one extraordinary nation. Whereas Mesopotamia, etc., they probably fought amongst themselves with each other, others continually warring, etc., etc., so they weren't being very civil. But they were the first, they were the cradle, okay, of all nations. We must look then rather to Syria or Arabia than to Ethiopia as the cradle of the Egyptian nation. At the same time, we must admit that they were not mere Syrians or Arabs, but had from the remotest time whereto we can go back distinct characteristics whereby they have a good claim to be considered a separate race. What was the origin of these special characteristics cannot indeed be determined until the nature of differences of race is better understood than it is at present. Perhaps in ancient times the physical traits of an ancestor were, as a general rule, more completely reproduced in his descendants than they are now are. Perhaps climate and mode of life had originally greater effect. Some of the Egyptian characteristics may be ascribed to these influences. Some may, on the other hand, be confidently attributed to intermixture with African races. Okay, so they walked into Africa, they mixed with them, merged with them, intermarried, had descendants who were hybrids, yeah, or half breeds, right, from which they were far from holding altogether aloof. Their complexion was probably rendered darker in this way. Their lips were coarsened, because they probably went there in this hot desert, and over time, you start to go brown and darker. You don't necessarily go black, but you can get very, very dark. That's why Alexander the Great, when he went there, he said like raisins, apparently, black like raisins, because of the sun there, the hot desert sun. Their complexion was probably rendered darker in this way. Their lips were coarsened, and the character of the eye was perhaps modified. The Egyptians appear to have been among the darkest races with which the Greeks of the early times came into direct contact. Alexander the Great. Herodotus calls them blacks, but this is an extreme exaggeration. akin to that by which all the native inhabitants of Hindustan have been turned the N-word. The monument shows that the real complexion of the ordinary Egyptian man was brown. That's the real complexion, with a tinge of red, a hue not very different from that of the Copt or the Ethiopian at the present day. The women were lighter, no doubt because they were less exposed to the sun. They covered up and all that sort of stuff. The monuments depict them as yellow, but there can scarcely have been as much difference between the men's colour and the women's as existing paintings represent. So yeah, being traders with the Phoenicians, the Sea People, the Assyrians, the Arameans, etc., they probably intermingled, merged, intermarried, and had hybrid descendants and so forth. The hair was usually black and straight. In no case was it woolly. So these Hebrew Israelites going on about Africans and Egyptians mainly having this woolly hair, that Jesus had woolly hair, incorrect. Though sometimes it grew in short crisp curls. Men commonly shaved both the hair and the beard and went about with their heads perfectly bare, or else wore wigs or a close-fitting cap. Women always wore their own hair and plaited it in long tresses, sometimes reaching to the waist. The hair of the wigs, as also that which is found sometimes growing on the heads of the mummies, is coarse to the eye of a European, but has no resemblance to that of the Negro. The Egyptians, figure 11, where's figure 11? It's not here, it's further on somewhere, had features not altogether unlike those of their neighbours. The Syrians, because these people, they were called the Blackheads, because they had black hair, not because they were black. The Egyptians had features not altogether unlike those of their neighbours, the Syrians, but with distinguishing peculiarities. The forehead was straight but somewhat low, the nose generally long and straight but sometimes slightly aquiline. The lips were over full, but the upper lip was short, and the mouth was seldom too wide. The chin was good, being well rounded and neither retreating nor projecting too far. The most marked and peculiar feature was the eye, which was a long, narrow slit, like that of the Chinese, but placed horizontally and not obliquely. An eyebrow, also long and thin, but very distinctly penciled, shaded it. The colouring was always dark, the hair, eyebrows, eyelashes, and beard, if any, being black or nearly so, and the eyes black or dark brown. Don't forget, this Rawlinson actually went to Egypt, looked at all the monuments, etc., and made his assumptions from there. Well, unless he examined the local people at that time as well. In form, the Egyptian resembled the modern Arab, the Saudi Arabian of today, etc. He was tall, his limbs were long and supple, his head was well placed upon his shoulders, his movements were graceful, his carriage dignified. In general, however, his frame was too spare, and his hands and feet were unduly large. The women were as thin as the men and had forms nearly similar. So we assumed long ago that they might have been from India, because the religion, etc., is quite similar. If you study it, their belief system, the religious belief system, appears to be similar. Depends on what books you read on India and Egypt. Okay. In form, the Egyptian resembled the modern Arab. He was tall, his limbs were long and supple, his head was well placed upon his shoulders, his movements were graceful, his carriage dignified. In general, however, his frame was too spare, and his hands and feet were unduly large. The women were as thin as the men and had forms nearly similar. Children, figure 15, however, appear to have been sufficiently plump. They had a bit of fat on them, right? But they are not often represented. The most ancient document which has come down to us bearing on the history of Egypt represents the Egyptian people as divided into a number of distinct races. We read of Ludum, Anamim, Lebahim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Kasluhim, and Kaphtorim as distinct sons of Mizraim, or Egypt, i.e. as separate tribes of the powerful people which inhabited the two Egypts. That was the north and the south. It is suggested, or the upper and the lower, it is suggested that the Ludum were the dominant race, or Egyptians proper, who were called in Egyptian Lut or Rut, i.e. men par excellence, that the Anamim were the Anu of the monuments who were dispersed widely over the Nile Valley, and gave names to On, Heliopolis, and other cities, that the Naphtuhim, Ta, were the domain of Ta, or people of Memphis. Pathruism, Tores, the people of the south, were inhabitants of the Thebaid.